So we had an advisory panel of leaders, many attending today, and one of the things that they said when we were asking about what the conference should be about, what they said loud and clear was we want one where we hear from our peers about work they've actually done in really practical terms. So that's what these next 4 sessions are all about, really. 12 of your colleagues leading organisations across the cultural sector, across the country and across all scales. And in addition to these sessions, as Peter just mentioned, there's also written case studies online that tell the stories of these leaders today, and also another 12 who have written for us too. This first panel is focused on innovation and enterprise, and I'd like to welcome to the stage Kira Estelle, CEO of Libraries Unlimited, who run 50 libraries in Devon, Anissa Hagdadi, founder and CEO of Beat Freaks Collective, and that's here in Birmingham, and finally Jane Finnis from Culture 24. So, Kira, if I can start with you, in this first panel, looking at innovation and enterprise, could I start by asking, how are Libraries Unlimited innovating at the moment, and how innovative are libraries today?
I think that libraries are incredibly innovative, actually, and incredibly adaptive and resilient. And I think if you look at the history of public libraries over the last 100, 150 years, they've constantly been changing in response to the way that people are changing their tastes, the way they live their life. And if you think about something like the internet, libraries, public libraries in this country were the first civic and cultural organisation to bring free internet into local communities. And I think there's a huge amount of innovation happening in libraries across the country at the moment. And it's fantastic to have 6 library services that are becoming MPOs and a sector support organisation. But austerity has been pretty tough on libraries, I think it's fair to say. And in Devon, what we decided to do was set up Libraries Unlimited to become an independent organisation, to become a public service mutual, to build really deeper, stronger relationships with our communities, and to be in a position where our libraries can thrive rather than simply survive. So that's pushed us into an innovation space, an expectation that we will innovate, will need to innovate, bring new sources of funding in from lots of other places. And so we've been very kind of receptive to new funding streams from the Arts Council, and we have an innovation project at the moment called Unlimited Potential, which is around reaching audiences in North Devon that we've traditionally not reached. And it's given us the space and time and resource to take a few risks, but crucially, I think, for our staff group there to have some skills development, some real opportunities to think about how do our libraries reach people for whom the library has not been a place that they've used traditionally. So that's one of the ways that we've started to innovate.
Brilliant. Thank you, Kira. I'll be coming back to you in a bit. But right now, I wanted to hear a little bit from Jane at Culture 24. Hi. So it'd be great, Jane, if we could talk a bit about Culture 24's Let's Get Real programme.
Sure.
Could you tell me a bit about, what was the problem that you were trying to solve with that initiative? What was wrong around digital and innovation?
Okay, so we started with Let's Get Real about 5-6 years ago, and it's a collaborative action research programme that's looking at building digital capacity. So there's been a lot of mentions earlier this morning around digital change and how difficult that is for organizations. So we started a project operating in that space. We brought together a coalition of the willing, if you like, those organizations that were sharing a same problem, trying 6 years ago even to understand, what does digital really mean if you're a museum or a gallery? How do you measure success? How do you do anything like that? And we wanted to try and take a different approach. In essence, it's a sort of R&D type program, but it's not the usual R&D, which is often borrowed from other sectors, that is quite innovation-driven from the top down and product-led. This is much more about innovating with what you have. It's about looking at working practices, and it's taking a grassroots approach of which is very collaboratively working. And what we found is that the challenges that digital was bringing to organisations were really indicative of a kind of a sharp end of a wedge of much greater change that is affecting the whole sector around a need to be more open, a need to be more agile, a need to be less hierarchical. So the organisations who were kind of early on getting involved in Let's Get Real found themselves facing issues that, through the digital lens, that actually were coming up all through their organisations.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Well, in a minute, I'm going to ask you a bit more about exactly what is Let's Get Real. But before that, I'd like to come to you, Anissa. I know that you're fiercely passionate about social enterprise, young people, creative innovation, and your home city that we're in today, Birmingham.
Woo!
So there's passion in action. So what was the opportunity that you were exploring when you created Beat Freaks, and how did the fact that you're a social enterprise affect the structure of what you created?
Well, it's exactly as you said. I think Beat Freaks is born out of Birmingham. You can't extract it from Birmingham, even if you wanted to. And we can't get the Birmingham out of Beat Freaks. We can't get the Beat Freaks out of Birmingham. But actually, we responded to a big tear that I had in myself between the creative and the entrepreneur, the art and the business. But actually, that mirrored a tear that was in the city and society at large. A big breakdown in communication and trust between young people and institutions that are supposed to serve those young people. So I'd hang out with organisations who would say to me, where are all the young people? We need to talk to them. We need to know what they think. And then I'd hang out with all these young people who are like, they don't listen. They don't care. We're out here doing it for ourselves anyway. And Beat Freaks was very much born out of that, a space to convene young people, give them space to debate and express themselves, but also to build those bridges back to those organisations. So we started really simply with an experiment. If I set up a poetry jam in an independent coffee shop, would any young people come? What would they have to say, and would anyone care? They did come. They had a lot to say. I was going to swear then. And people did care. And actually, that's, Poetry Jam's still at the heart of our movement, but it's at the heart of our business as well. We started, before there was a logo and a website, I started with a lean test. Was there traction? How do I grow from that? And that's how we've now got to the Beat Freaks Collective, which is 3 companies, one of which is an NPO. But I think that, part of that is about the story I tell myself about myself is that I'm a social entrepreneur, and that's allowed me to bring that rift together, that tear. And social enterprise allows you to be commercially impactful whilst recognising you can't extract that from being socially impactful. So we ask questions like, instead of for profit, profit for what? And we I think that that's afforded me a new lens and a new way of seeing ourselves in this sector. And I kind of encourage more people to see themselves as social entrepreneurs in here.
Love it. Thank you very much indeed. So, and that kind of leads us on quite nicely, doesn't it, Kira, to sort of hearing a little bit more about the sort of practical actions around creating that sort of sense of enterprise in the organisation. So these sessions are all about kind of action and decisions, what you've actually done. So could you tell us a bit more about the actions that you've taken to create a more innovative culture at Libraries Unlimited, and what impact those sort of interventions have made so far?
I think having a new governance structure and coming out of a local authority has given us a platform really to talk about innovation. And what I find, I led the library service for 8 years in the local authority in Devon County Council, and I've led it now as an independent organisation for the past 2 years, is that we talk so much more about our vision, our values, our purposes than we ever did when we were in the local authority. And I think you've got to keep coming back, and I think somebody said that this morning, you've got to keep coming back to that because you need to be driving innovation for those purposes. We have had one or two really big initiatives. For example, we've opened 2 fab labs in our 2 largest libraries, so fabrication laboratories with a whole ton of digital making equipment, 3D printers, laser cutters, the whole lot. And I think that's been a really important thing about signalling both internally and externally that we are changing, and that libraries are about creating culture, consuming culture, developing ideas. So those have been very important signals, I think, to our workforce and to our stakeholders. But I think you can't just go for big, shiny things. We have 50 libraries across Devon. Some of them are very small. We have 300 staff spread across a big county. So I think it's about creating that culture has to be about the much smaller things, but actually the much more important things that start to build a culture that's around innovation. We're still starting. We've come out of however many years in a local authority environment, but we are doing a piece of research with the University of Exeter at the moment, which is exploring the social and financial value of libraries, and it's a piece of action research where we are enabling staff to come together in action learning sets to explore ideas around how they can be how our libraries can be much more socially enterprising. And I think that's been a really fascinating experience of giving staff the space and time to work together and to come up and try often quite small ideas, but it's that, I think, that helps to drive a culture that's much more enterprising and much more innovative.
Amazing, thank you. And I must say, I was at one of the Fab Lab launches in Devon a few weeks ago, and there was this man who was a library user. He was a little bit more mature. He was, towards the end of his working life or employment life, and he was stood there and he was going to talk about the Fab Lab, wasn't he? And he had a yacht, and it was about 8 foot high and about, I don't know, a metre long. And I thought, why has he brought this model yacht along with him to talk about this little Fab Lab place? I thought maybe that there's an anchor on the yacht or something that is, made in the library. Turned out the whole yacht had been made in Barnstable Library in a fabrication machine. And he said, oh yeah, in November last year I didn't know anything about 3D printing, and by December the 20th I'd built this yacht. And I was kind of like, oh my God. And then he was talking, wasn't he, about the young people that he interacts with. All of the members of his club, his boat club, are now members of the library. I mean, it was a real illustration of kind of shifting thinking and the kind of community engagement. The noise in that library is extraordinary. Let alone
We like noisy libraries.
Yeah. So coming back to you, Jane, you were going to talk a bit more perhaps about exactly what Let's Get Real involves for organisations across the country who you've worked with over the last 5 or 6 years.
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's fantastic to see this sort of ripple of a different type of innovation and a different kinds of experiment happening across the sector. I think the last 5 years there's been a lot of change. And I guess Let's Get Real is a program designed around that sort of idea. It's basically 10 months. We bring together 15 or 20 organizations. It's collaboratively funded, focus on a theme that everybody, whatever problem people are looking at, the themes at the moment, the current Let's Get Real is looking at social value and digital and trying to unpick that. Past themes have been on storytelling, on measuring success, on brand. But basically, it's similar to the stuff that you were saying. The idea is that you learn from each other, you learn together, and you learn from experts. And it's that kind of, the meshing together of that methodology that's so powerful. And we use experiments as the centerpiece of the action research, and that people are, wherever they are in their journey, they might be at the beginning, they might be a little bit further on. Within the group, there might be very different abilities, different levels of confidence, but each experiment gives people an opportunity to kind of test out a hunch, to jump in and kind of try and do something. It's a sort of, the idea of an experiment in a risk-adverse organization can be a way to contain risk, which can be very helpful, I think. And that if you're starting very much with what you have and what you've got and the problems that are understood in your organization, then it's a very easy way to kind of build momentum step by step. So it's kind of innovating from the bottom up rather than the top down.
I love it. And I love that idea of learning from each other, learning together, and learning from experts. That sounds really like that. That sounds like something.
Well, it's good attitude for life, really.
Yeah, exactly. Anissa, as well as being structured in a different way, you sort of talked about the collective, the different elements before, and that social entrepreneurial spirit. You also think and behave differently, don't you? Could you say something about that, how your organisation behaves that enables innovation?
Yeah, I mean, I think when people hear about the collective, the first question they tend to ask me is, so how do you make money? And I think a much more interesting question would be, how do you see value in your organisation and how do you seek to increase it? And I think people get a lot more out of us and asking us about our model when they ask us about our culture in tandem with our structure. Because the truth is that, you know, the behaviours came first, then the culture, and then the culture led to the structure. So you can't kind of re-extrapolate back the other way. But I think, you know, we behave differently, and also that, you know, behave differently to who and to what. But, you know, we're kind of really interested in how we create value in different ways, how we surround ourselves with different people constantly. I like to think that if everybody's like-minded, somebody's not thinking. So we like to find ourselves, you know, I like to go to conferences like this, but I also like to put myself on the edge of conferences that are full of marketeers or full of technologists so that I constantly feel a little bit uncomfortable. And I think that that allows me to think differently. But we also think about how we give value and extract value from our clients and partners in a completely different way. So we might work with Lush Cosmetics to help a young filmmaker make some art activist content about the environment. But then part of our collective might help them to develop a communication strategy for how they should speak to young people as their workforce. And then another part of our collective might help them to evaluate what they do with their staff in a completely different way. One partner, 3 different ways of seeing value, 3 different ways of innovating, all iterative, all building from each other, all reinforcing our agility and our position. And I think that that's quite an interesting way of working, and more people should think in that way.
It's really exciting. I really love hearing you talk, and I love the idea that if we're thinking the same, then someone's not thinking. That's really nice. So, Kira, can we talk a bit about what steps you might suggest other cultural leaders should take if they want to generate a more innovative culture and way of working? You know, you described kind of coming from that local authority context, which, whilst libraries have always been innovating, wasn't perhaps a context that really fostered and enabled that.
No.
You've brought some of that in now over the last couple of years. What would you suggest people might start with if they were thinking along these lines?
It's something that I think about quite a lot, and I think that I think I used to think that it had to be me that drove the innovation, and I think I've probably been guilty of some of that. And I think I'm increasingly learning to sort of stand back, sorts of things that you were saying, to sort of stand back, but to create the conditions in which innovation can flourish, remove some of those barriers. And I do think that expert role, we had a creative catalyst come in on our Unlimited Potential project. So somebody, a producer role to kind of connect people up, and that's been really powerful. But my sort of top tips, if I had them, are this is not necessarily for everybody, but it's certainly worked for us, is to engage with your local university. You know, working with the University of Exeter, the business school, we work with a new welcome centre there, and actually it's incredibly stretched, certainly my thinking, but it's also shown me very clearly, and I think our team, that some of the kind of bumps along the road that you inevitably have when you're a new organisation trying to really do different things in a completely different way are natural and normal, and it really helped me to realise that actually what we were experiencing was no different in terms of turbulence than anything else. So working with the university, I think have a tendency to say yes to things. I'm terrible at saying yes to things, such that we end up that we end up with a 7-foot sculpture called Bell House that Collider. They just asked me if we would have a sound sculpture in the library, and of course I just said yes, but I didn't ask how big it was. And the manager of the library said to Kira, "Do you realise how big it is?" But we said yes, and it was a phenomenal success in terms of the engagement. I think for people out here that don't have relationships with your local library service, I would strongly encourage that, because I think what you will find, I mean, some library services are going through very tough times and timing is really critical, but I think lots of library services are incredibly open-minded and actually up for taking a risk. And what you will find in the library service is access to an incredibly large and diverse audience, probably more diverse than any other arts organisation. For us, I think looking outwards, looking around, looking for sort of unusual friends, I think, as you were saying, putting yourself in spaces where you find sort of, we're trying to do lots of work around science, for example. We work with the Exeter Science Park. As a new MPO coming in, we'll be working with the Knoll West Media Centre in Bristol, Create Gloucestershire. Organisations that, the RSC, people that we might not necessarily think to work with as a library service. So I think finding unusual friends, but whose values align around yours, I think is really important. And I think my last point probably would be about taking the time to reflect and learn. And I think when you're kind of driving forward an organisation, particularly a fairly new one, there's a kind of pace which is kind of constant and it's always looking to the future. But I think just creating an environment where you do sit back and create that atmosphere where you can talk together about what's gone well, what's not gone so well, and I think that's really, really important.
Really nice, thank you, Kira. So Jane, could you say a bit about the impact? We've heard about the reason for Let's Get Real, we've heard about the format. Could you talk a bit about the impact on organisations and what you've learned as an organisation that's been kind of hosting and presenting this programme?
Sure. I mean, I think for the participants on the programme, the impact is personally transformative, as is with all of this kind of intense collaborative working. But what we have always tried to do, and I think what has happened in a large number of cases, is that people go back into their organisations as kind of agents of change. So they come away with a different way of working, a different way of looking at a problem. And the kind of adoption and kind of the awakening of the sector to sort of like digital transformation is happening at different speeds in different areas, and a lot of people still are very unconfident. A lot of people haven't made their first steps yet, or maybe the steps they've made they're nervous about. And I think that the role of individual leadership within organisations, it can come from anywhere when it comes from digital, and that you have to find who those champions are and the people that know and listen to them and talk to them. And it really is about digital transformation isn't necessarily just about skills. It's very, very important that it's about digital confidence and digital literacies across the whole organization. So it's not about, knowing how to use a social media platform or knowing how to interrogate your analytics or being able to program something. It's actually about what is the impact that's happening to your organization. How is it changing your purpose? How is it impacting on your audiences and their behavior and all of the touch points that you have for them? And how is it changing society? I mean, there's been a lot of talk earlier about the responsibility of our sector to sort of respond to changes, and digital culture has some very fantastically positive democratic empowerment in it. It's also got a lot of things that are very worrying, and that there's a role, I think, for cultural organizations in all of that. I think the thing that we've found to be really powerful, and I know some of you may be expecting to see Matt Locke here speaking. He's worked a lot on Let's Get Real. We've worked alongside him, and we've adopted one of the things he always talks about, of which there's a case study about on the website, which is this idea of rhythm. He's written a really nice piece about that, but he talks about rhythm as being the path of least resistance. It's the thing that you do after you've been to an event like this, and you go back and life just sort of goes, and then it's all like, that was all really well and good, but reality takes over. And we need as change is about changing that rhythm. It's about looking, the very personal rhythm of you as an individual person and your team. And I think that's a very profound idea he's talked about, and it's come up a couple of times today. But yeah. It's worth thinking about, I think.
Definitely.
We'll go back.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Jane. Yeah, and it's a shame that Matt couldn't make it today, and he for some family reasons, he had to cancel at the last minute. That idea about organisational rhythm, and if you want to innovate, finding those natural rhythms of your organisation rather than trying to change those rhythms that are so fundamental.
Yeah, work with them.
Work with them is really interesting. So we've got about just over 2 minutes left, and my last question to you, Anissa, is you talked about creating the conditions for others to innovate a bit earlier. What are those conditions, and how do you do that? Maybe this rhythm idea kind of fits into that in some ways.
You're lucky I'm a Brummie because we speak fast. For me, kind of, innovation is a really porous thing, right? Like, you kind of incite it, but it also happens to you and around you. And we've been asking a lot of questions in our organisation about, if we're on the brink, the cusp of this fourth industrial revolution, and the last one actually only served, a few people, how might the sector be at the forefront of making that a more inclusive space? That can carry everyone with it, and our answer to that is allowing people to build from your capital. So whether that's your social capital, like your brand or your network or your name, or your intellectual capital, the data that you have in your organisation, or the things that you know, or your financial capital, you're building your cash. how are you opening that up to allow more people, more communities to build their own value so that they can exchange it with you in a different way? The main thing in that, yes, it's a good thing to do, yes, it's the right thing to do, but actually it affords you proximity to those people. It puts you around the people who are already thinking differently, already acting in a different way, and it allows you to shape your organisations together. And that's what we do. We open up our capital where we can and increase, people being able to build their own stuff, which I like to think of as building the thing that will build more things.
I love it. Thank you so much. So thank you all so much. In fact, it is time to move on. These sessions, we saw them very much as being adverts for your case studies and the online resources, the other case studies that are also related to this area of innovation and enterprise. Thanks for bringing your experience, your direct experience, what you've actually done in the sector. If you'd like to know more about these organisations, then access the conference website. You can read their case studies, you can link through to their websites, and you can also find links to the sector support organisations who are funded to help us all to make some of the kinds of changes that our panel have talked about today. The other case studies on the website are from Story Things, from Matt that Jane was talking about earlier, from Black Country Living Museums, and from the RSC. So now I'd like to thank Kira, Jane and Anissa.